Hi there again, and welcome to the Explaining History podcast. Today we've got a real treat. We have the historian Philip Augur joining us. Philip Augur and co-writer Keely Winstone have written an excellent new book, Agent Twister, on the very complex life of John Stonehouse, the disgraced Labour politician who in 1974 faked his own death and who was deeply involved with as a spy for Czech intelligence, passing on confidential information, top secret information from the British government. Today, the sound quality in this little bit might be slightly not what it normally is, because a lot of my recording equipment is packed up because I'm moving house. So apologies for that. Anyway, without further ado, we'll dive in and hear from Philip. Thanks very much. All the best. Bye-bye.
That's good.
Okay, so welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. Today, I am very pleased to have Philip Augur here, who, along with Keely Winstone, has recently written a new history. It's a kind of a narrativized sort of history, isn't it, of the story of John Stonehouse, the disgraced Labour Member of Parliament, who faked his own death and who had an extraordinary life of kind of espionage and crime. One of the kind of the scandals that perhaps is slightly less well known, most people are acquainted with things like the Perfume scandal or the Cambridge spies. But this has recently come to prominence because there was a BBC dramatisation with Matthew McFadden and Keely Hawes of the story. But anyway, I am going to hand over to Philip now to tell us a bit about the story of John Stonehouse, who he was, and the events that occurred. Welcome, Philip.
Nick, thank you very much. And on behalf of Keely Winstone as well, thank you very much for asking me to speak out about our book. You described it as the Stonehouse story. We think of it as a sort of fast-moving biography. Really, we've tried to write it as though it's a fictional, fast-moving novel in that style, and it's one of those cases where the truth is actually stranger than fiction. So let me just tell you a bit about the story. John Stonehouse and who John Stonehouse was and when things happened. The key event actually happened at the very end of 1974. And by that time, John Stonehouse was still a Labour MP. He'd been very prominent in the Labour Party in the 50s and 60s, and in Harold Wilson's Labour government from 1960 through to 1970, Stonehouse had some pretty senior ministerial positions. He was never quite in the cabinet, but he attended cabinet. He was Minister of Aviation, Minister of Technology. He was Britain's last Postmaster General. And for a while, he was very much seen as a rising star of the Labour Party. Some people thought he might be a future Prime Minister. By 1974, though, his star was slightly in the wane, and we'll perhaps come on to the reasons for that a bit later. There'd been a general election in 1970. Wilson had lost that. The election was won by the Conservatives under Edward Heath, and Stonehouse, like the rest of the Labour MPs, was in opposition. And the event for which he's best known is that at the end of November 1974, he quite simply faked his own death in quite bizarre circumstances, really. He flew over to Miami, stayed at a very luxurious, rather famous hotel, the Fontainebleau Hotel. It's where Elvis had stayed, where Frank Sinatra used to sing. It was where the opening scenes of Goldfinger were actually filmed. Sean Connery's famous dive into the swimming pool all happened there. So Stonehouse flew over there. He checked into his room. He took along a colleague to accompany him. They went about some fairly routine business meetings. Colleague went for a nap. Stonehouse said he was going swimming.
Mm-hmm.
He cunningly checked his clothes into the beach club, made sure that he was noticed, and made his way down to the sea, apparently to go swimming, except that he didn't go swimming. He crept round to the hotel next door, where he'd stashed a set of his clothes, a spare passport and tickets and credit cards and other things, and then just simply disappeared to the other side of the world, to Australia, where he made his way quite safely through customs and immigrations with the intention of starting a new life.
Mm-hmm.
That was the faked death of John Stonehouse.
So, I mean, what had led to him taking these extraordinary measures? What is some of the backstory here?
Well, that's a very good question. And there are three reasons, really. Keely and I think that probably the biggest reason was that as his political star had waned, he got a taste for high living, a very expensive lifestyle, and he decided that if he wasn't going to be a government minister, he lost some money as a result of that. His salary went down, but he would replace that lost money by starting his own business.
Mm.
And the business that he started a number, but the one that got him into trouble was a business that was a bank, and the bank just didn't work out very well at all. There was a banking crisis at the time. The period 1970 to 1974 was a tricky period in British history. Heath's government lost control of the economy. First of all, having a kind of dash for growth in the early 70s. That went wrong. Inflation came into the system. There was a property crash. Banks went under. The Bank of England had to launch a lifeboat fund to rescue them. Mm-hmm. And in the kind of damage of the bank that Stonehouse started, simply failed. Mm-hmm. Rather than admit to this failure and just put his hands up and say, it went wrong, Stonehouse led his fellow directors and investors a fairly merry dance, cooked the books, and by the end of 74, his auditors, his accountants, the people that looked carefully over the books, were absolutely onto him. Mm-hmm. He was, there was going to be disgrace. So that is one of the reasons. The second reason we should talk about is that in the 1960s, late 50s and throughout the 1960s, when Stonehouse was a member of Parliament in the early days and a government minister in the later days, he had been reeled in by the Czech security services. The Czechoslovakia at that time was if you like, a Russian proxy. Mm-hmm. We're in the days of the Cold War, and the Eastern Bloc agents were very keen to find anything they could about British government, British society, British business, and the Czechs were kind of proxy agents for the Russians. Mm-hmm. They paid Stonehouse quite a lot of money for tidbits of information. He was pretty careful. He didn't give them a huge amount. He was careful not to leave a paper trail. But we found in the Czech National Archives a 500-page file relating to Stonehouse's activities, and it proves, we think, conclusively that he was accepting money over a long period. Mm-hmm. The Czechs, was feeding them with a certain amount of information, and by 1974, defectors were appearing on the scene and beginning to name Stonehouse as one of their agents, and so he needed that. And thirdly, by then, he had his marriage was breaking down. He was a serial philanderer, I think it's fair to say, and he wanted to escape, possibly to run away with his girlfriend, a woman called Sheila Buckley, who was also his secretary. She wasn't in on the act initially, but we suspect that eventually he hoped to persuade her to join him. So those three reasons, money, espionage, and love.
Yeah. He strikes me really as a kind of a classic fantasist. A lot of his decisions seem to be made on these kind of imagined projections of what might be possible. Setting up banks, faking your death, that sort of thing. I would imagine that the Czechs probably didn't get their money's worth out of him, really. But that strikes me as being actually quite common with. There's an interesting point made in I read it many years ago, the Michkin Archive, the book with all that came from all these sort of recovered materials from after the Cold War, and so after about 1956, after the kind of the Budapest uprising, the number of kind of believers, the number of sort of British or Western moles that really believed in what they were doing and cared about what they were doing declined. And then you had to the Soviets and the Czechs and the East Germans and other people had to pay money. And the standard of intelligence that they got was fairly minimal as a result. Would you say that's probably the case with Stonehouse?
Yeah, you've made 2 points there, Nick. One was whether he was a fantasist, and then the other did the Czechs get their money. Let's deal with let's deal with them both, but we'll start with the second if you like. I think that the way espionage works is that, I mean, obviously what they hope to get is a kind of deep throat who'll really spill the beans. What seems to happen most normally is that they're having to put together a jigsaw puzzle from various sources. Stonehouse presumably provided some small jigsaw pieces. The Czechs weren't happy with the information they were getting, but they continued to pay him for a period. And frankly, the minute if you're a government minister, the minute you accept money from an enemy agent, in fact, the minute you're an MP and accept money from an enemy agent, you're really in trouble. You're open to blackmail.
Mm-hmm.
Second, so the first thing you asked about was he a fantasist? He was certainly an optimist. He was certainly a great believer in his ability to pull off these amazing tricks. We've looked at lots of video archives, and my co-writer Keely is a documentary maker. She's got a rich, she knows her way around this field really well. And we've looked at lots of interviews with Stonehouse. We've heard him speaking. He's an incredibly persuasive speaker.
Mm-hmm.
He's good looking. He's charismatic. The words flow off his tongue in a kind of silver torrent. He was incredibly good salesman. In fact, while he was Minister for Aviation under Harold Wilson's government in the 1960s, he was very successful in selling civil and military planes on behalf of the British government and British companies. He's a really able, a really persuasive salesperson, and so he very confident in his own abilities, very determined, and so he was able to remarkably create a pretty convincing false identity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Having created that identity, he then got the kind of chutzpah to fly across the world, breeze through customs and immigration, set himself up in a new life in Melbourne, Australia. So rented an apartment in a block of flats, so confident that he went to the local jazz club, integrated himself into the local community. He just pulled it all off. A very charming, persuasive con man, if you like.
Mm-hmm. I note from the book that the scandal itself was covered up successfully by several governments, and I find it interesting that not only was this covered up by Heath, but also Callaghan and Thatcher as well. What incentive would they have had to do such a thing?
So you made a really good point there, and you picked up what we think is really the most important historical strand in this whole thing. I mean, it's a very interesting tale. It's a cracking account of the sort of the pre-internet age, really. It would have been much harder for Stonehouse to pull this off with the internet and lots of security cameras around, but we think he could still have done it. So you've got that angle, but there is a serious political angle here. So we'll go back, if you wouldn't mind, to 1969.
Sure.
And Stonehouse by this time is a senior government minister. Harold Wilson is the prime minister. And Wilson is told by the security services that a Czech defector is alleging that John Stonehouse was effectively a Czech spy. Wilson summons Stonehouse into number 10. Stonehouse goes through the big black door, up the stairs to the PM's drawing room, and he doesn't know what's going to happen. Is he going to be offered a more senior job or what? Oh no. Wilson plays it absolutely beautifully and says, John, I think you know Mr. Elwell. And this is Elwell from Charles Elwell from the security services, and they confront Stonehouse. Elwell interviews Stonehouse a couple of times. They actually interview he interviews him in the RAC club on Pall Mall. And Elwell concludes that there's no evidence that would stand up in a court of law. He reports back to Wilson, there's nothing here. Wilson drops it. I should think Wilson was very relieved by this, because Cold War rumours, false rumours, we think, always circulating that Wilson himself was a Russian sympathiser.
Mm-hmm.
His parliamentary position is precarious. He doesn't want to hear anything at all about it. He's actually quite relieved to hear this, and he says, he called it off. There doesn't need to be a full inquiry into this. Mm-hmm. The stories bubble up again one or two more times over the next few years, but the government doesn't really want to know. The security services don't push it through very hard. But then we come through to 1978. Now, by this time, Wilson has retired and has been replaced as Prime Minister by a man called James Callaghan. Mm-hmm. Sitting on a very, very thin majority in Parliament, and hardly a majority at all, really. And the story resurfaces again. So Callaghan is a former naval man, takes security matters very seriously. And so he asks to hear a bit more about it. And he decides that what he's going to do is to ask Harold Wilson to come back in. Wilson's been out of office a year or so by this time. Yeah. And Callaghan says to Wilson, what do you know about this? Wilson really says he can't remember very much about it. And it looks, reading the files, it looks, he doesn't, perhaps he's forgotten, but it must have been a pretty dramatic episode, even in a prime minister's life. Being confronting a minister with a senior security services man. But Wilson sort of brushes it aside. Callaghan doesn't look very much further. So now we've had Wilson and Callaghan, the two Labour prime ministers who have been, who've heard the stories, not looked too deeply into it. But then a few months later, Conservative backbenchers who are looking for a reason to bring down the Callaghan government, he's hardly got a parliamentary majority at all, and they start to press the matter. And they start to sort of threaten questions in the House and all the rest of it. So Callaghan decides that what he will do is he will bring the leader of the opposition into the inner circle. And the leader of the opposition at this time is one Margaret Thatcher. She hasn't been leader of the opposition for very long. The position is not yet secure. And Callaghan absolutely plays it beautifully. He says he wants to talk to her on Privy Council terms, which means that it stays between them. She agrees. He explains that her backbenchers are pushing for an inquiry. There's a bit of toing and froing, but Callahan eventually reports back to Thatcher and says, look, we've looked into this. The stories are still there, but there's nothing which will stand up in a court of law. Thatcher agrees to call off her backbenchers, and so the story is buried yet again. So we've now had Wilson, Callahan, and Thatcher, 3 prime ministers who've all agreed not to look too deeply into it. We find that really surprising. It's and in the case of Wilson and Callahan, it's a matter of political embarrassment because it would have embarrassed their party. In the case of Thatcher, she was briefed that she was told that there wasn't enough evidence to stand up in a court of law. So I suppose she's safe. Later on, though, when the stories bubble up again, by this time she's actually prime minister. It would have been embarrassing, we think. And again, she brushes it away because there's not enough to stand up in a court of law. I think it looks to us as though Callahan quite carefully manoeuvred a relatively raw leader of the opposition into agreeing to look the other way.
Because it's interesting, isn't it? Because she chose to out Anthony Blunt, name him as a Soviet agent. So she wasn't kind of above such things. But it must be your thesis that that Callahan had played her successfully. I think probably is pretty clear there.
Yeah, she outed Anthony Blunt, who had a position. He was keeper of the Queen's Pictures, a massive establishment figure, turned out to have been some sort of agent. When he was outed, Thatcher spoke out in quite strong terms about traitors and treachery and so on in the House of Commons. We mustn't threat to national security, all the rest of it. It was actually only a few months later that she received another round of stories that Stonehouse had been spying. That must have been very embarrassing for her. And this is the moment when the Attorney General really saved her blushes. The Attorney General was a political appointment, saved her blushes by saying there probably isn't enough evidence to stand up in a court of law. So again, she was able to let the matter drop.
And when would that have been chronologically? Because of course, in the mid-19, I think it's 85, you have the issue with Spycatcher and Peter Wright.
This was 1980.
Okay, so it's interesting that it's a kind of a recurring theme for Thatcher for some years, these sort of issues with supposed treachery and intelligence.
Yes, I mean, these were different times, Nick. There was massive public and political and media interest in it. The Cold War of the 60s was still very much in recent memory. I was
going to say, by way of contrast, and casting no aspersions, had a British Prime Minister in kind of 1974 gone on holiday, abandoned his security detachment, gone to a wealthy Russian citizen's villa and got drunk with them, and even however innocently that might have been, this would have been a kind of extraordinary matter. But of course, our former Prime Minister Boris Johnson did precisely all those things, and to little more than a shrug from most commentators. So the context of the Cold War really does frame everything, doesn't it?
Yes, it's in the context of the Cold War that you have to see the Czech security service as really kind of the acceptable face of communism, if you like. The Russians use them as a soft way into the West.
Mm-hmm.
There were many Czech agents operating out of the Czech embassy at this time, and other MPs were also snared by them.
Yes. Yes. I mean, from your kind of reading of the Stonehouse story, does it suggest to us that, was Stonehouse a kind of a colossal outlier, or is there a kind of a history of British MPs really existing out with the rules that govern everybody else?
Well, that's a leading question, isn't it, in these days, in the year 2023?
Yes. Or perhaps a better question would be, in that period, perhaps that's a better question to ask.
I mean, it's hard to say. That another Labour MP called Will Owen was named by a Czech defector, and he, like Stonehouse, admitted having taken money from Czechs, denied that there had been great secrets passed across. He was acquitted after a controversial trial. What's different in the case of Stone, and what is different now is that we have the Czech archive, which actually it's not just hearsay evidence. So I'm only aware of the only other direct parallel I've got is Will Owen and John Stonehouse. Stonehouse is an outlier. I mean, in terms of this going to these extraordinary events to fake his own death. I mean, we might just spend a minute talking about that, just how he did it. First of all, he phoned his local hospital and asked for the names of males about his age who died recently. He then visited the widows of a few of these males in order to identify whether or not they'd had a passport. So having identified a couple of males about his age who'd never been abroad, he then applied for their birth certificates, used the birth certificates to apply for a passport. So he's now got a passport in someone else's name. He disguised himself a little bit and had passport photos taken. So he's now got the means. He then applied for various credit cards under the assumed names, set up bank accounts under the assumed names, using secret Swiss bank accounts, booked airline tickets under the assumed names, and then just disappeared and lived. It's an extraordinary piece of bravado, isn't it?
Yes.
It's a staggering story. So, your question whether he's a fantasist, I'd put him more down as an optimist, just a great believer in his own abilities, a believer, if you like, that the rules don't apply to him.
Yeah.
That, I think, is where there is a read across to some politicians today.
I guess that my final question would be, because a great many people are sort of very much more acquainted with the kind of the Cambridge spies, I see that my sense of Stonehouse is he's a completely different creature from them. Would I be right in thinking socially he doesn't come from that kind of class background at all? That's a fair assumption.
He's a completely different animal to the Cambridge spies, partly through social background. His parents were Labour activists, ordinary people. But the crucial difference is that Stonehouse wasn't ideologically motivated.
Yeah.
He was simply in it for the money. And he's a curious man because there are streaks of idealism running through him, through his career. He's got a great sympathy for the underdog. He's able to identify with the underdog. He did good work in developing countries, but there's always this theme running through his activities. There's very often questions about financial propriety. It seems to me that you've probably got fundamentally quite a decent man who could never live within his own means. He just got sucked in too deep. Perhaps a little intoxicated by power. So there's this belief that he's above the rules. And then once he's in it too deep, he just kind of doubles up the bet each time and loses and gets further and further. And he's in it up to the neck. I think it's that. It's not an ideological thing.
No. And so he was extradited, wasn't he, from Australia back to Great Britain, and prosecuted. Mm-hmm. And how does the story end?
So he's extradited. He's prosecuted really for financial offences, theft and fraud. He's sentenced to 7 years, serves about half the sentence, lives on a few more years, writes 4 books, one under a pseudonym, does a bit of work on the chat show circuit. And in fact, he's on a chat show when he collapses and dies. Not quite on air, but very soon afterwards. A dramatic.
Right. So kind of almost goes out in the glare of the public eye.
The lights went.
And it's an extraordinary story, and I guess it helps to take a sort of like a snapshot of the times, I guess, and I think it's interesting you mentioned it's a scandal of the pre-internet era.
Yes, I mean, I to be honest, I borrowed those words from the Financial Times. The Financial Times describes our book as having a delightful pre-internet feel.
Yeah.
And one of the things we wanted to get across to readers was, this is how it felt like. This is what happened when there's a general election broadcast, the first time they ever use a swingometer. This is the night when election night TV runs through the night for the first time.
Yeah.
This is an age when you could, even if you're a public figure, quite safely cross the world and hope not to be recognised. It's a very different era. Okay. Yeah. We do think that could you do this again? Could you do it today? If you were brave enough, you could have a go at it. Yeah.
Well, quite possibly. No doubt somebody will. Well, there, Philip, we must finish. Thank you so much for your time and for coming on to talk about Stonehouse. The book is now available in all good bookshops. Am I correct in thinking?
Yes, the book is called Agent Twister.
Okay. So I beg your pardon. I'll post a link to it in the show notes. And just a shout out to the listeners. If you can, please do try to purchase it from an independent bookshop, because they really need your help and they really need your support.
And just one last thing. Wait a week and it's out in paperback. So it's out in paperback on June the 8th.
There you go. My mother is reading it and enjoying it. So there you go. There's a kind of a quality recommendation for you.
She sounds like a great woman.
Well, she is indeed. She knows her wrong when she reads about them. Thanks so much, Phil, and all the best with the book. And I do hope we speak again. Thanks so much.
Okay, Nick. Thanks for inviting us. Bye.
All the best. Bye-bye.